okay? Okay. And can you all see that okay? Okay, great. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Maze Adams, a peer tutor and biology major with the Marian University, with Marian University. Throughout my time as a tutor and as a biology major, I have noticed a common phrase when talking about STEM papers. I'm not a STEM major. I'm not sure I could help, or I don't even know where to start. So typically, science-minded writers, they're not coming for help with their calculations. Rather, they're coming for help with their writing. They're wanting to understand the writing process. And as people highly involved in writing centers, it is our duty to be as inclusive as possible. And that inclusivity implies bridging gaps between the liberal arts and STEM. STEM literacy is incredibly important. And as such, we need to incorporate technical writing into our tutoring practices. Throughout this workshop, we'll do a few things. First, we'll look at some evidence-based practices such as genre analysis and transference. Then we'll go over some general guidelines before doing a mini-lab. And this mini-lab is designed to facilitate creativity and help give an idea of what goes into making a lab report. So, why is this important? Most of my friends within STEM have expressed surprise at how much they've been asked to write. Looking at the data and common communication methods, it's not all that surprising that being able to communicate results effectively is a foundation for most careers in STEM. What can we do though? Not all of us are STEM majors, and it can be unrealistic to expect every writing center to have tutors that specialize in technical writing. Through interviewing my professors and several peers, I found that support areas don't require any technical knowledge. Most of what I'm asked for help with is style, understanding the writing process, proofreading and editing, and understanding why it's important to be able to write cohesively. These disparities between STEM and the liberal arts can often be bridged using genre analysis. Typically, STEM majors will assume that everyone knows what they're talking about. That's not the case, as proven by my ramblings about calculus in the writing center and everybody looking at me like I'm crazy. So this lack of understanding between the writer and the tutor can lead to barriers within collaboration and, quite frankly, frustration for both parties. So what can we as tutors do? We can help with organization, transitions, clarity, and cohesion. We can also help with understanding the style. An example of a successful tutoring session with a technical writer would be reading the essay while looking for clarity, transitions, and organization. And we can also examine sample lab reports, which I'm sure all of us have done. I know I've looked at sample essays, looking at philosophy. That's not my forte. So another possible method for alleviating some of these gaps is transference, in which you, as the tutor, facilitate connections between STEM writing and other types of writing the writer has had experience with. Some questions you might ask are, how is this project like essays you've written before? How is it different? Or how could you apply this project to future assignments? Or even, what prior context do you have? A discussion section is often a good time to discuss these questions. Any experiment has a goal. They have something that they want to communicate, and the writer has something that they want done with the data. Whether that's to get them an A in Gen Chem, or whether it's to open up further research opportunities, depends on the writer. With the first type of writer, in which they want an A in Gen Chem, you can ask whether the material could be applied to their future career. For example, as a future medical professional, I often research the medical context for each of my Gen Chem experiments. I found that it helps me to be motivated to write when I actually care about the topic. So, what even goes into a lab report? You hear this word, and right now it sounds like a made-up word if you're not a STEM major. So each lab report typically has 5 key sections: a background, a hypothesis, an experimental or methods section, results, and a discussion of the data. The background section typically assesses the key information the reader will need to know to be able to understand the data. This information might include an overview of the formulas used along with the reasoning. It might also talk about the method and the impact the method has on the data. And typically it also provides context for why you're doing this. And typically the hypothesis is categorized under the background section. The hypothesis typically asks why. Why are you taking the time to do this? What are you trying to find out? What do you think will happen? And typically after you figure out your hypothesis, you'll figure out how in the ever-loving hell you will prove it. The theoretical methods typically vary slightly from your experimental section. Things go wrong. Earlier this week, I was doing a gravimetric analysis and I accidentally poked a hole through my filter. And had to redo the whole thing. So the experimental section should explain what you did, the variations in the techniques, and your sample size. If you used a different solvent than initially planned, state it. Just the more details in this case, the better. The goal of this section is for the reader to be able to repeat your method given the same materials and time. While you are running your experiment, it's key to take as many notes as possible. These notes might include diagrams, numbers, calculations, qualitative observations, and potential sources of error, like the hole in the filter. The results section is typically the most math-heavy section of the entire report, and it's the longest. This is where you will not only see overviews of qualitative data, but also tables and graphs that detail the quantitative. These quantitative observations might, and quite often should, be supported by sample calculations that show the reader how you did the math and potential sources of error within the calculations. Fortunately, you shouldn't have to do any calculations in this activity coming up. And if you do, I have questions, a lot of them. The discussion section is most similar to a typical essay. In a discussion section, you discuss whether your hypothesis was correct and support your conclusion using evidence from your data. You can also discuss potential sources of error, potential changes if the experiment were to be repeated, and potential applications for the data. So, I wrote the lab report. I'm done, right? No. Nice try. As with any academic writing, it is key to cite your sources. Depending on your field, you might be asked to use different styles. The most commonly used are APA, Vancouver, or the American Chemical Society, which is often shortened to ACS. APA is one of the most used and what you might be more familiar with. And in-text citations typically follow the author date style. The Vancouver style is often used in many journals and institutions in the medical field, and in-text citations use an author number system. And the most complicated and variable citation out of all of these is ACS, which is typically used amongst chemists. There are multiple ways to use in-text citations and multiple ways to organize the references section. And these differences typically come down to the professor. So, some general guidelines for technical writing, as told by my chemistry professor. Keep it simple, stupid. More precisely, be concise without sacrificing clarity. Identify and stick to your message and purpose. Don't go talking about the legs on a butterfly if it's not immediately relevant to your experiment. Additionally, keep your experimental and results sections separate. Don't talk about your data when you haven't even done the experiment. Furthermore, avoid redundancy. Assume your reader is kind of paying attention. Not always, but kind of. And finally, simplify your language. In my chemistry professor's words, you're trying to make a scientific breakthrough, not be the next Charles Dickens. There have been some instances where he's like, oh my gosh. So, now that I've put you to sleep for a bit, we're going to do a mini lab. In groups, you'll be given popsicle sticks, rubber bands, cardstock, pipe cleaners, scissors, and tape. Your objective is to build a tower that will stay standing when at least one notebook is placed on top of it. Feel free to try multiple structures. You will have 20 minutes to build and test your structure. Then we'll take 20 minutes to write in your groups. And finally, we'll have about 10 minutes for peer review and discussion. And if we get finished early, we can shift this around.